All right, everyone, welcome back. Today, we're tackling a topic that, nobody really likes to think about, but let's be honest, we all need to pay attention to compliance, or more specifically, 2024's biggest compliance disasters. Think of it like, those what were they thinking moments, The ones that make you wonder, how could that possibly happen?
Mhm.
But instead of just shaking our heads, we're going to really break down these massive blunders, figure out what went wrong, and most importantly, how to avoid making those same mistakes ourselves.
Exactly. I mean, there's so much we can learn from studying these kinds of failures, especially when it comes to compliance. These aren't just random events. They often point to deeper problems that can affect any organization, really.
Right, and that's what we're here to uncover. So to kick things off, we've got a lineup of some, well, shall we say, infamous names. Wells Fargo, Amazon, Theranos. Yeah, even in 2024, the Theranos saga was still unfolding. Plus, Volkswagen's emissions issues just seem to keep going and going. And we'll wrap things up with the dramatic implosion of FTX, which is probably still pretty fresh in everyone's minds. So, are you ready to get started? Because first up, we've got Wells Fargo, and you'd think they would have learned their lesson after all the scandals a few years back. But here we are in 2024, and they're getting hit with penalties for, get this, the same issues. Unauthorized accounts, crazy pressure on employees to meet sales goals. It's like compliance Groundhog Day. So, what gives?
Well, this is a perfect example of how a toxic culture can completely undermine any compliance measures you might have in place. You see, Wells Fargo had all the right policies, procedures, you name it. But the problem was this relentless pressure to hit sales targets. And that created an environment where people felt like they had to cut corners, even if it meant doing things that were unethical.
Wow, so it's like the system itself was pushing people to do the wrong thing. That's kind of scary to think about.
It is. And it's a reminder that compliance isn't just about having rules on paper. It's about creating a culture where people actually want to follow them, where they understand why those rules are important and where they feel safe speaking up if they see something that's not right.
Okay, so moving on from that somewhat depressing thought, let's talk about Amazon. Now, I've got to admit, I was pretty shocked when I heard they got slapped with a huge GDPR fine. I mean, we think of Amazon as this data giant. If they can mess up data privacy, anyone can, right?
Absolutely. And what's interesting about Amazon's case is that it wasn't about some kind of malicious intent. The issue was more about not being clear enough with users about how their data was being used and not auditing their data practices as thoroughly as they should have.
So it's kind of like you can't just set things up and forget about them. You need to constantly be checking in and making sure everything's still running smoothly.
Right? Just like you wouldn't skip your annual checkup just because you felt fine last year, you can't ignore data privacy just because you think you've got it all figured out. It requires constant vigilance, regular checks, and always making sure you have clear consent from your users.
All right, so we've got Wells Fargo with their toxic culture, Amazon and their data privacy slip up, and now let's move on to a saga that's been going on for years and still having repercussions in 2024. Theranos. This case is like a cautionary tale that keeps on giving. Even years after the initial scandal, we're still seeing the consequences of their, well, let's call it what it was, deception.
Theranos is a classic example of what happens when a company puts hype over substance, choosing to hide things instead of being transparent. It wasn't just about their technology being flawed, it was about a systemic lack of transparency with regulators, investors, and most importantly with patients. And on top of that, they didn't do enough due diligence when it came to third-party vetting of their technology.
So this raises a really important question. How can companies make sure they're working with partners who share their ethical standards? Because just checking off boxes on a due diligence checklist doesn't really cut it, does it?
You're absolutely right. True diligence goes much deeper than that. You need to really dig into potential partners' backgrounds, understand their track record, see how they've handled ethical issues in the past, and understand their approach to transparency.
So it's about more than just business goals. It's about finding partners who align with your values.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember that compliance isn't just about avoiding penalties and lawsuits. It's about building trust.
Yeah, trust with customers, employees, investors, the public, it's a big deal.
Exactly. And that brings us to another case where a lack of transparency and a culture of fear led to a major breakdown of trust. Volkswagen. I know it feels like a broken record at this point, but the fallout from their emissions scandal was still going strong in 2024.
Right. It's like if Volkswagen's emissions were a song, it would be on permanent repeat. But all kidding aside, this case is a serious reminder of what happens when people are afraid to speak up within a company. Problems don't get solved, they just fester and grow, and eventually the truth comes out in a way that can be really damaging for everyone involved.
You hit the nail on the head. The Volkswagen scandal wasn't just about some faulty software. It was about a corporate culture where people were discouraged from raising concerns. And that's a recipe for disaster. It allowed the problem to go on for years, ultimately causing huge damage to their reputation, their finances, and of course, the environment.
So the lesson here is pretty clear. Whistleblower protection isn't just a nice to have, it's essential. You need to create an environment where people feel safe speaking up, even if it means delivering bad news.
Exactly. And that sense of safety goes beyond just having a way to report things. It's about creating a culture where speaking up is seen as a positive thing, a contribution, not some kind of betrayal.
Right, because the people who are raising concerns are often the ones who care the most about the company.
Exactly. And, speaking of things that are still top of mind, let's wrap up this part of our deep dive with a case that I'm sure everyone remembers, the collapse of FTX. It was a wild ride that shook the entire crypto world, and it really highlights what happens when compliance is basically an afterthought in the rush to grow and make money. What's really worrying about FTX is the apparent lack of basic internal controls and governance. It's almost like they were operating in the Wild West,
Right.
with very little oversight and an environment that allowed all sorts of questionable activities to just flourish.
So the takeaway here is don't get caught up in the hype and forget about the fundamentals.
Absolutely. Robust systems, checks and balances, strong governance. These things aren't just bureaucratic hurdles. They're the guardrails that keep a company on track. In FTX's case, the absence of these safeguards led to a spectacular crash that sent shockwaves through the entire industry.
And that crash had consequences far beyond just FTX and its investors. It really damaged the reputation of the whole crypto market. It's a reminder that compliance isn't just about protecting individual companies. It's about protecting entire industries and making sure that innovation doesn't happen at the expense of ethical behavior.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, I think we should take a quick break and come back to dive deeper into the implications of these cases in part 2 of our deep dive. We've got a lot more to unpack, so stay tuned.
We'll be right back. And what's really striking about the FTX case? It wasn't just a compliance failure. It was like a failure of imagination. I mean, a lot of regulators, they just didn't see the risks coming from these new financial platforms. It shows how we need rules that can keep up, agile, adaptive frameworks that can keep pace with how fast things change.
Yeah, it's like trying to use a map from the 1800s to navigate a city today, right?
Yeah.
The old ways don't always work in this new world.
Exactly. The FTX situation is like a wake-up call, showing us that we need spaces where these new technologies and ways of doing business can be tested out, like regulatory sandboxes. That way, regulators can get a handle on the risks and figure out how to protect people before things go mainstream.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, right? Where we can encourage innovation, but also make sure consumers are protected.
Exactly. We don't want to stifle progress, but we also don't want to create a situation where anything goes.
Right, like a digital Wild West.
Precisely. And this balance is important for all sorts of industries, not just crypto. Think about AI, biotech, even the metaverse. We need rules that can adapt to these new technologies without sacrificing things like privacy, fairness, and security.
It's like building a bridge while you're walking across it, right? You got to keep moving forward, but make sure the foundation is solid enough to support what's coming next.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of strong foundations, let's step back for a minute and look at what all these cases have in common. We've got a toxic culture at Wells Fargo, data privacy issues at Amazon, deception at Theranos, fear of speaking up at Volkswagen, and a total lack of control at FTX. What's the common thread here?
Well, it seems like a lot of these issues come down to companies saying one thing and doing another, right? Like, it's easy to have a nice sounding code of conduct on your website, but it's a whole other thing to actually live those values every single day, especially when you're under pressure to perform or facing tough competition.
Absolutely. It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And that starts at the top with leadership. Leaders have to be the role models, setting a good example for everyone else. They have to hold everyone to the same ethical standards, no matter what their job title is or how well they're doing.
It's like that saying, actions speak louder than words, right?
Yeah.
It's especially true when it comes to building a culture of compliance.
Couldn't agree more. And that culture needs to be reinforced through clear communication, training programs, and open channels for people to share their concerns. It's not enough for people to just know the rules. They need to understand the why behind them, why ethical behavior matters, why data privacy is important, why it's good to speak up when you see something wrong.
Because nobody wants to feel like they're just following orders blindly, right? They want to understand the bigger picture and how their work contributes to something meaningful.
Exactly. When people feel like they're part of something bigger, something that aligns with their own values, they're more likely to embrace compliance as part of their everyday work.
Okay, so we've talked about culture, leadership, communication, all these big picture concepts. But what about the nitty-gritty practical side of compliance? What are some concrete steps companies can take to strengthen their programs and avoid becoming the next cautionary tale?
Well, one of the most important things is to have a strong risk
Hmm.
assessment process. It means proactively identifying potential areas where things could go wrong, figuring out how likely those risks are and what the impacts would be if they happened, and then coming up with effective ways to reduce those risks. It's about being proactive, not waiting for something bad to happen before you take action.
So it's like having a weather forecast for your business, right?
Yeah,
You want to know what storms are brewing so you can prepare and batten down the hatches.
exactly. And once you've identified those risks, you need to have clear policies and procedures that address them directly. These policies should be tailored to your industry and your specific business operations, and they need to be reviewed and updated regularly because regulations change, best practices evolve, things are always in flux.
Yeah, it's like that compliance landscape is constantly shifting, just like those technologies we were talking about earlier. What was considered best practice a few years ago might be totally outdated today.
Exactly. And it's also crucial to remember that compliance isn't just the responsibility of one department or one person. It needs to be embedded in the DNA of the entire organization. Everyone, from the CEO down to the newest hire, has a role to play in making sure the company is operating ethically and following the rules.
It's like a chain, right?
Yeah.
One weak link can break the whole thing. One rogue employee, one overlooked data breach, one missed red flag, and it can have a ripple effect that impacts the entire organization.
Precisely. That's why fostering a culture of collective responsibility is so important. Everyone needs to understand that compliance isn't someone else's job, it's everyone's responsibility.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Culture, leadership, communication, risk assessment, policies, collective responsibility. It's a lot to take in, but it all comes down to this. Compliance isn't just about avoiding fines or bad press. It's about building trust, protecting your reputation, and ultimately contributing to a more ethical business world.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And, it's easy to get caught up in the weeds of compliance and lose sight of the bigger picture. But at its core, it's really about doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient, even when it might cost you something in the short term.
Because as we've seen from these 2024 compliance catastrophes, the cost of doing the wrong thing can be much higher in the long run. The damage to your reputation, the financial penalties, the loss of trust, those are wounds that can take years to heal.
And sometimes those wounds never fully heal. The companies that succeed in the long term are the ones that understand that compliance isn't a burden, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to build a stronger foundation for their business, to earn the trust of their stakeholders, and to contribute to a more ethical and sustainable world.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? What are the key takeaways they can apply to their own work, regardless of their industry or role?
Well, I think the most important lesson is that compliance isn't a finish line. It's a journey. It's an ongoing process of learning, adapting, and evolving. The companies that do well in this area are the ones that embrace continuous improvement, always looking for ways to strengthen their programs and stay ahead of the curve.
So much to think about, yeah. But if you had to leave our listeners with just one key takeaway, what would it be? What's the most important thing to remember when navigating this crazy world of compliance?
Well, I think it all boils down to trust, really. Building trust with your customers, your employees, your investors, everyone you interact with. When you truly prioritize ethical behavior and make compliance a core part of who you are as a company, you're not just mitigating risks, you're creating a foundation for long-term success and sustainability.
Yeah, that's powerful. It's not about checking boxes or avoiding penalties. It's about building genuine, trustworthy relationships.
Exactly. And as we've seen with these 2024 compliance disasters, the cost of breaking that trust can be enormous. It can damage your reputation, alienate your customers, and even threaten your very survival.
A steep price to pay for cutting corners or looking the other way.
Absolutely. But, on the other hand, the rewards of putting compliance first can be huge. It can strengthen your brand, help you attract and keep great employees, and even give you a competitive edge.
It's like investing in a top-notch security system for your business, right? It might seem like a big expense up front, but in the long run, it protects you from much bigger losses.
That's a great analogy. And just like a security system, compliance needs regular attention and upkeep. You have to stay vigilant, adapt to new threats, and always be looking for ways to improve your defenses.
So to wrap up our deep dive into these 2024 compliance cautionary tales, let's leave our listeners with this. Compliance is more than just rules. It's a way of thinking, a mindset. It's about making ethical choices, building trust, and creating a better future for your business and the world around you.
Well said. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are people, experts, whole communities out there ready to help you on your compliance journey.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We hope you found this deep dive insightful, maybe even a little bit inspiring. Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay compliant.